But the fact is that his legacy is going to be a poor one. Like I said, this is the worst prime minister in Canadian history. It's not even comparable to the ones who struggled. I don't really know what his legacy will be. He thinks that he accomplished a lot. He's delusional enough to believe that he did much in 9+ years as prime minister, but all he did was hurt the country, make it poorer, make it less credible on the international scene, and make it weaker overall.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm James Heale. I'm joined today by Michael Taube, who is a columnist for the National Post and a former speechwriter to Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Now, in the last hour, we've learned that Justin Trudeau is going to be resigning shortly as the Prime Minister of Canada, having been in office since 2015.
Over the holidays, I've also had a chance to reflect and have had long talks with my family about our future. Throughout the course of my career, any success I have personally achieved has been because of their support and with their encouragement. So last night over dinner, I told my kids about the decision that I'm sharing with you today. I intend to resign as party leader, as prime minister, after the party selects its next leader through a robust, nationwide, competitive process.
Michael, could you start by telling us why now? Why has Justin Trudeau chose to go when election is due by October?
I think a lot of us have been saying for the past few years, James, why hasn't he gone years ago? This is what's actually been kind of astonishing. This has been a process which has dragged out at a level we've never seen in this country, and certainly for other countries, whether they follow the Westminster model like you and I do, our country, my country, and your country, or otherwise. It has been a very frustrating scenario that has turned off, obviously, conservatives to begin with, but has gradually included Liberals, New Democrats, and others that I'm sure we'll talk about, to the point where close to 70% of the country, according to a recent poll, has suggested that Justin Trudeau, before today's announcement, should resign or quit immediately. That's a number that's unheard of in our country. And although obviously Liz Truss in your country has sort of debatable numbers that way, I think generally speaking in Canada, where we've had obviously leaders who have taken, as they call the proverbial walk in the snow, like his late father Pierre Trudeau did, Justin Trudeau has just been an incredibly stubborn person, and not only the worst prime minister in this country's history, in my opinion, according to a recent piece I wrote for your publication, but also the most delusional. Many things that we'll get into.
And so talk us through the time frame now. So he gave this press conference this afternoon, and he says that he will be resigning as Liberal leader when a replacement can be found. How do you think the next couple of weeks and months are going to unfold?
That's a fascinating question. I mean, he has prorogued Parliament until March 24th. So one assumes that from today, January 6th to March 24th, there will be some sort of a leadership race. Now, that's up to the Liberal Party to determine. They have to choose within their organization when it's going to start, any deadlines that they'll have for candidates who are forthcoming, of which some we may talk about, and how the procedure is going to go from there. But it's been said now on organizations like CBC and CTV, two of Canada's national TV networks, that it has to be decided quickly, that this long, drawn-out process we've seen with Justin Trudeau and the highs and lows, mostly lows, that he's experienced as prime minister, it can't go on for much longer. So a decision will have to be made shortly, but by proroguing Parliament until March 24th, he's obviously gained some additional time.
What did you make of that press conference? He spoke for about half an hour. He repeatedly said he was a fighter, not a quitter, words that our very own Liz Truss also used shortly before she also resigned. He said he was quitting. Why do you think it's reached this crisis point? Was it all those people coming out over Christmas and saying, frankly, all the different caucuses saying, frankly, we no longer have faith in him anymore?
Well, it certainly doesn't help when the three major party caucuses that have historically supported the Liberal Party, that being the province of Ontario, the province of Quebec, and Atlantic Canada in general, which is an entire region, when all of them come out and say that they want him gone, James, that is basically a clear sign that even someone as delusional as Mr. Trudeau must recognize is a problem. And I would think that he would understand this. I think at that point he realized it, but the issue that probably struck a nerve more than anything, and I have and many others have included laundry lists of mistakes and blunders and other things that this prime minister has made since he was first elected in 2015. The biggest issue that I think tilted everything was the resignation, an abrupt one, of his deputy prime minister and finance minister, or then Chrystia Freeland, who has been one of the most liberal, loyal ministers he's had, and also one of the most respected within the Liberal caucus itself. When she basically came out and said that the proverbial bus had been rolled over with Mr. Trudeau driving it, and stating that he had lost confidence in her ability, that she obviously was clearly frustrated and furious, and I'm naturally just paraphrasing from her lines, but you could see the anger and the anguish that was within her words and within her news release. This was someone who had stood by him the whole way. Now, in private, we have no idea. She might have felt the same thing. She might have felt differently. But I think she finally realized that the self-described liberal feminist prime minister, who's had a lot of issues with other female ministers, cabinet ministers especially, but even his parliamentary secretary as well, I think she came to the realization that if even she's not safe here, and clearly he will do anything to stay in power. That's not surprising when you consider the nature of politics and leadership, but I'm sure to her, having been a loyalist for so long, it was probably a stinging blow that she never saw coming. And I think that was really the final straw, not only for her, but also Liberals who had backed Mr. Trudeau for whatever reason for so long. And I think they all realized that the time had come, even though the polls had actually shown that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, who are the opposition party of this country, have been far, far ahead for over 2 years and in double digits for more than a year. The time had come.
And you mentioned there about Pierre Poilievre. I mean, how do you think the next sort of 6 to 8 weeks or so, as the Liberals try and find another leader to take over from Trudeau, how do you think they should play that? On the one hand, obviously, in some ways it's a great success. They finally got rid of Trudeau, who won successive elections. But on the other, of course, they sort of have to wait and can't intrude on private grief because it's up to the Liberals to decide who's better than Trudeau.
I think that's an apt description. Yes. I mean, I think the next 8 weeks are going to be a period of very quick decisions, very quick moving. They'll be scurrying like mice to try and get this done. And that's understandable because they realize the time is of the essence. Even if the Liberals cannot survive government, which most likely the next federal election will be this year at some point, many of them want to save their own political hides, that being their own seats. Therefore, they're going to get their act together as quickly as they can, ensuring that it's probably a small contingent of leadership candidates, because if it's too big, it's going to be a bit of a mess. Some of them will probably heavily back people like Ms. Freeland, one assumes will probably run. Mark Carney, who many of your viewers may remember as the former Bank of UK governor and former Bank of Canada governor as well. He is certainly a viable candidate. Dominic LeBlanc, who is a close friend of Mr. Trudeau for many years and currently is finance minister. He sort of was pushed into the role very last minute after Ms. Freeland abruptly resigned. Those sorts of people are going to be out front and center, along with other ministers like Melanie Joly and other names that are not of a pressing importance to many of the listeners and people that you're probably not going to be familiar with to start with, but they would be regarded as major contenders for the Liberal leadership and ultimately the next prime minister of this country. So in a nutshell, they have to move very quickly in these next X weeks, because in 8 weeks' time, he's going to be gone, supposedly. Parliament will no longer be prorogued. A vote of non-confidence in this parliament is possible, and we could see a very fast turnover in a very quick election or a long, drawn-out process. We'll see.
In some ways, as you say, Justin Trudeau's death has been very long and drawn out, even if it's now come to a very quick resolution. Tell us why Pierre Poilievre has been so successful in the polls for his leadership, as you say, leading now for 2 years. How has he been able to kind of remake the Conservatives into this now apparently hegemonic force, winning by-elections last year, and according to some polls, 25 points ahead of the Liberals?
I met Pierre a very long time ago, more than most. I knew him when he was an intern in the political party, which shows the gray hair on my head, but and some appearing on his too. But regardless, I knew very early on, as a lot of people did, that there was a real force there. Someone who was very intelligent, very knowledgeable, very policy-oriented, and very much a small C conservative, both politically and economically, and culturally as well. We saw someone who could be a viable replacement for or a new good conservative leader to Stephen Harper whenever he had chosen to resign. Now, this was years ago. Mr. Harper, as we know, left as prime minister in 2015. It's been a volatile period of time for the Conservatives. They've had two other leaders, Andrew Scheer and Aaron O'Toole. Both of them were leading into the election periods of 2019 and 2021, respectively. But in both cases, unfortunately, there were mishaps, slip-ups, most of which is obviously just either a period of inside baseball or just domestic issues that just caused the end. This is where Pierre Poilievre is different, James. Pierre Poilievre is an intelligent, studious individual. He has learned from the mistakes of previous conservative leaders since Mr. Harper left in 2015, and he's learned not only in terms of how to create a good formula of leadership and how to actually lead the country, he's built a conservative brand sort of a la Boris Johnson in the UK, Scott Morrison in Australia, even Donald Trump a little bit in the United States, although all of them are clearly very different than Mr. Poilievre, where you've basically tied in conservative ideas and a populist type ideology, where you've encouraged people who are not naturally conservatives, they weren't born that way, they don't vote that way typically, to look into conservative ideas that would make sense for them about the economy, about politics in general. But Mr. Poilievre has also even gone further by trying to encourage non-conservative Canadians to look at him by looking at issues that matter to them. The affordability crisis that we're currently having in Canada, high housing rates, high energy rates. He has looked at certain things, even like cryptocurrency briefly, issues and ideas that don't necessarily fit into the conservative wheelhouse, but he has found a way to sort of build upon them, much like the Republican Party in the United States. The old liberal Republicans used to find ways to tie themselves together, say, to the working class. That is to Mr. Poilievre's credit. It's not something that, quite frankly, I or many other conservatives would have naturally given him as advice, but he's not only taken it, he's written it incredibly well and has done exceedingly well with this platform, to the point that many Canadians, no matter their political stripe, are encouraged by what Mr. Poilievre has to say. That, combined with Mr. Trudeau's foibles, has led Mr. Poilievre to be in a position to become the next prime minister, and barring something extremely unforeseen, which I don't think even most liberals believe will happen, Mr. Poilievre will become the next prime minister of this country, but he's done it by building bridges to individuals, communities, families, and others who don't naturally or inherently support or vote conservative.
Mr. Poilievre may well be the next big dominant figure for the next decade in Canada. We've mentioned Stephen Harper, who had that role from the mid-2000s to the mid-2010s. Why then did Justin Trudeau, why was he so successful for so long? He, as you said, had many foibles, and yet somehow was able to keep winning 3 successive elections. Tell us why you think he was so successful for so long.
In a nutshell, there was a fair bit of luck in it, but there was also a little tiny bit of skill in the beginning, and I'll explain it this way. Stephen Harper, who's my old friend and my old boss, because I worked for him as his speechwriter and various other capacities, had been prime minister for roughly about 10 years. As you know, James, in your country, there is a period of time when the voters get antsy or tired of the government in power. We saw that recently in your country last year. Unfortunately, it happened to mine as well in 2015. It had less to do with Stephen Harper, but more to do with the change of minds or change of hearts of many voters. So for that reason, Justin Trudeau was able to get in with a completely different program, a completely different formula. And it was kind of astonishing because in the previous federal election in 2011, the Liberals under Michael Ignatieff had fallen to 34 seats, which was a record low for that government and that party in its long history. Yet somehow in 4 years, Mr. Trudeau was able to rebuild it based on some of the reasons that I provided. Since that time, and I know this sounds partisan, but it really is true, it has been the luck of fools that he has survived this long. And the reality is because the Conservatives mostly have made mistakes that they shouldn't have at the worst possible times. As I alluded to, Mr. Scheer and Mr. O'Toole, both fine leaders, both had many good qualities, both would have been fine prime ministers. They made a lot of mistakes during the campaigns and even the lead-in to them that led to, unfortunately, many Canadians who were concerned about conservative ideas and policies, which are not natural in my country. Just because I'm appearing here doesn't mean there are a lot of them. Many Canadians by nature are middle of the road. They tend to historically support the Liberal Party, who has governed in this country roughly about 70% of the time, give or take, of this country's history since 1867. For that reason, they feel more comfortable in left of center or progressive parties like the Liberal Party. So for that reason, he got very lucky. Because his opponents kept making mistakes, he survived, but he was barely surviving. In 2019 and 2021, for example, he didn't win a majority of support in either election, but because of the first past the post system we have due to the Westminster model, he survived continually and had governments that were minority governments, but he found ways to exist in 2019, and in 2021, he made a supply and confidence agreement with Jagmeet Singh and the New Democratic Party, who are Canada's basically socialist alternative, to keep them in power for an extended period of time. And Mr. Singh and the NDP, to their detriment, decided to keep him in power for a long time because they liked power, they craved it, and quite frankly, Mr. Singh, like many Canadian politicians, is getting closer to his pension, as we like to call it in Canada, gold-plated pension kicking in. He's only a few weeks away. Some believe, and it's hard to say because he obviously has publicly denied it, that he may have had ulterior motives why he was continuing to do it. But regardless, that's really how he survived, James. And I know that sounds simplistic, but it's really true because of the litany of mistakes, errors, blunders, pitfalls that this prime minister has had, both nationally and internationally. In any other time, with almost any other prime minister, even my old friend Mr. Harper, it would have been incredibly impossible to survive. Yet just by luck, he has hung on. And I think finally, at long last today, the end is near.
And so tell us as a final question then, what do you think Justin Trudeau's legacy as Canadian Prime Minister will be?
You know, I hate being rude or nasty on things like this. I try not to be. I mean, it's hard sometimes, but we've all tried to bite our tongues as best we can because it's only fair. That's the position you and I are in or others are in. And if we just come out, with our fists of fury, it's not going to do anything and it doesn't benefit the discussion. Intellectual discourse still does mean something. But the fact is that his legacy is going to be a poor one. Like I said, this is the worst prime minister in Canadian history. It's not even comparable to the ones who struggled. Even Kim Campbell, for example, who some of your listeners may remember, or viewers may remember, who was a horrible prime minister, she would actually have been much better compared to him. Even poor Mr. Ignatieff with his 34 seats would have probably been a better option for the Liberals today than Mr. Trudeau. I don't really know what his legacy will be. He thinks that he accomplished a lot. He's delusional enough to believe that he did much in 9+ years as prime minister, but all he did was hurt the country, make it poorer, make it less credible on the international scene, and make it weaker overall. A thing that Mr. Harper tried to correct, and even though I disagree with them, former Liberal prime ministers like Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin, who some of you may be familiar with, I had many policy disagreements with them, but no one ever dismissed the fact that they were trying to do something as leaders. Even if you disagreed with it, you understood what the motives were. Mr. Trudeau's legacy is that he just skipped along, somehow survived, made comments like, budgets will balance themselves, that he didn't care about the federal deficit, making up words like people kind, going into NAFTA negotiations with Donald Trump, looking at issues like gender rights and indigenous rights instead of the most important one, yes, trade. If you look at all those things, you see a prime minister who was not cut out for this job. This is a person who should never have been near it. His father, Pierre Trudeau, for all his faults, all his mistakes, was a political animal. He understood political communications. He understood strategy. He knew what to do. His son, Justin, failed at every level to accomplish anything of those tasks. And that's why I've written a couple times that his father would be ashamed of him or embarrassed by him, because what he has done has really reduced the Liberal Party brand and his own political brand to almost nothing. If that's a legacy, well, I'd like to know what a good legacy is.
Thank you for joining us on Spectator TV today.